Good morning. Good morning to all you intrepid snow trekkers. Isn't that just wonderful? Aren't we having a wonderful winter? We haven't had this kind of winter for several years. This has been wonderful. My name is Ruth Robarge, and I may be a little soft in the head from the cold. That's true. So welcome here today. Appreciate you all making the effort to come out. One of the things we like to do is to welcome any visitors. So if you brought a visitor on such a day, or if you are brave enough to introduce yourself, why don't you give us stand up and say hello and tell us who you are and where you're from. Yes.
I'm Candy. This is my daughter, Jasmine. We've been interested in checking out the ministry.
Well, welcome. Welcome. And congratulations on finding us. Hello.
Hi, I'm Ryan. You're in Kansas City first time.
Oh, well, welcome, Brian. Thank you. Anyone else? And we, of course, want to give a shout out to those joining us online. If any time that you're not here, you want to join us online, that is, we are videoed and available on our website. So hello to all of you, and welcome also for joining us today. Do be sure that you silence your cell phones. You're certainly welcome to check in and let people know where you are. But if you could at least silence them, put them on vibrate, that would be very, very nice. We'd appreciate that. Let's see. There is not any Sunday Plus lunch today, and if there is an emergency and you feel like running out into the snow, there are exits here and here, and of course out the back. So people, front half can come around this way, back half can go out that way. Thank you again for making the effort to come today. I also want to point out that today we are not having the service that was scheduled, what was the name? It Gets Better service that features the music and RE departments. But we are going to have a fine service. We're going to do that service March 3rd. So we will be seeing all of their hard efforts. They've put a lot of work into it, so we will see that on March 3rd. Today we have Keely Schneider is going to do her sermon. Keely's a fine member of our congregation, served with her on the board. She is an excellent person, and it's a really interesting talk that she's going to give. So we look forward to that. So thank you again.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming out. I know this is a little different service than what was originally planned, but I'm glad you're here with me, and I'm glad that I was able to pinch hit a little bit this morning. But I'd love for you to join me for our opening words and responsive reading. And that is, I believe, 5:30. Is that correct? So if you have the hymnal, you can read there. Out of the stars in their flight, out of the dust of eternity, here we have come, stardust and sunlight mingling through time and through space.
Out of the stars have we come, up from time, out of the stars we have come.
Time out of time, before time, in the vastness of space, Earth spun to orbit the sun. Earth with the thunder of mountains newborn, the boiling of seas.
Earth warmed by sun, lit by sunlight. This is our home. Out of the stars we have come.
Mystery hidden in mystery, back through all time. Mystery rising from rocks in the storm and the sea.
Out of the stars, rising from rocks and the sea, kindled by sunlight on earth, a rose of life.
Ponder this thing in your heart. Ponder with awe. Out of the sea to the land, out of the shadows came ferns.
Out of the seas to land, up from darkness to light, rising to walk and fly, out of the sea tremble God.
Ponder this thing in your heart. Life up from sea, eyes to behold, throats to sing, mates to love.
Life from the sea, warmed by sun, washed by rain, life from within, giving birth, rose to love.
This is the wonder of time. This is the marvel of space. Out of the stars swung the earth, life upon earth rose to love.
This is the marvel of life, rising to see and smell. Out of your heart, cry wonder, sing that we live. We let our chalice lighters off today due to the weather, so I am lighting the chalice. I'm using this mic because I'm not smart enough to figure out the mic the children use. I light the chalice for respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Now, would you stand if as you are able or willing, and join me in affirming the words of our covenant? No. Stand and we will sing. Knowledge, they say, and then we'll have our covenant. Thank you. Now, please join me in affirming. Goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Please be seated. We're going to sing the children now to our classes, because a few of them did show up. You could do that from sitting. That's okay. And we're going right into the offertory. So the offertory today is being taken for the general budget. It's so nice to come into church and have the lights on and the heat on. And not just on Sundays, but all week long. There's so many things that we do for each other and for our community in this building and in this place. And the programs and the services and the staff and the electricity and the water and the heat all makes this a very warm, welcoming place. So will the ushers come forward and receive the, take up the collection, and thank you for your generosity. Please join me as we dedicate our offerings. We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
You'll have to forgive me. About 4 weeks ago, I got bronchitis, and I'm still fighting with it a little bit. So I've got my water up here if I might have to take a minute or two. Again, thank you for being here. It's always a great pleasure and truly a privilege to come up here and present to the congregation. I've had the opportunity to do that for several years in a row, and today, as you know, I'm pinch hitting a little bit, but what I decided to do was represent a sermon I did about 4 years ago, and I crafted it on the topic of science and spirituality. And what I decided to do is I did this in two parts. I did one sermon one year, and then I did a second sermon that kind of continued those thoughts and those concepts the next year. And so I decided to do the second one, not only because it goes through some of the concepts that were discussed in the very first one, but it goes through the evolution of all the things I was thinking about over the course of the following year. And so I thought that would be more of the summarizing or culminating ideas I have on this topic. So I hope you enjoy it. Just know that if you hear me referencing last summer, it really means like 5 years ago. As I recall, my presentation last summer wound up feeling more like a spiritual odyssey than anything else. By and large, I shared my thoughts on science and spirituality by telling you how my own journey in thinking about these concepts has unfolded over the years. I told you the story of the first time I ever contemplated science versus religion. A very close high school friend of mine wrote me a poem called The Pope and Darwin. This poem made such an impression on me that despite the fact that the original work has been lost for many years, I have always remembered this one particular stanza. He wrote, "The Pope and Darwin sat down for dessert. The Pope devoured his custard, savoring every delicious, silky mouthful, but he left the crust. Darwin shoveled forkful after forkful of a beautiful flaky pastry into his mouth, but he left the curd. How unfortunate it was that the Pope and Darwin failed to realize they were eating from the same pie." At that time in high school, this idea that religion and science must be somehow part of the same truth was actually quite novel for me. Up to that point, my interest in science and my religious education had never met. Science was an intellectual pursuit that had nothing whatsoever to do with God or religion, so the discussion of it simply had no place in church. My education in advanced physics ran parallel to my church schooling, never intersecting. I told you then that I really didn't think much about these topics again until long after college, law school, and marriage. I got busy with my life after college, building my career and starting my family, and so did not turn back toward religion or any other spiritual belief system until I had children. Right? I think I told you the story of my daughter Harper's first blush with death. Her pet tadpoles, Rocky and Rosie. You remember she had these tadpoles from a grow your own frog kit that my brother had given her as a gift when she was 6. I told him it's going to come back to haunt him later when he had children. So she received this gift, and when Rocky, the male, like we knew, was lifeless and virtually floating in his habitat, I ran to Luce Park to retrieve real pond water in a desperate attempt to revive this tadpole. Yes, it was quite the family drama. But like most bright, curious children, Harper was at the age of asking those big questions. And on this occasion, she asked, of course, what would happen to Rocky and Rosie when they die? And I really didn't know how to answer that. I didn't believe in heaven. The best I could do at the time was tell her that Rocky and Rosie will always be with her because they'll be in her memories and in her heart. But her question stuck with me because I wanted to give her an authentic answer. And finally, one day it did hit me. I questioned, what was the difference between a person the moment before they die and the moment after they die? Truly, there is no physical difference in the body 1 second before it dies and the second after it dies. No degradation of the body has begun, but a change happens in that moment. And for me, the key notion was energy. The energy that brought the physical body to life no longer resided in that body. The body was a container, something to house our human energy for a time. But I knew from science, from the law of conservation of energy, that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transferred or transformed from one form to another, including transformation into or from matter. This is basic science. This is Einstein's theory, E equals mc squared. Energy just simply doesn't disappear from our universe. So that was it for me, right there. That energy, which infuses life into our bodies, still resides within this universe even after death. It had to. It was scientifically impossible for it not to exist. And upon further reflection, I realized that not only does that energy continue to exist, it has always existed in this universe. Even Rocky and Rosie's physical bodies were born of the stardust of the universe. I confessed to you at that time that this one simple scientific concept was transformational in how I began to view the universe and my place in it. And from there, we went on to discuss a few areas of scientific research that are currently working on the very edge of science and spirit, efforts to understand what is the mind, what is consciousness. We talked about the growing body of scientific inquiry around the effects of meditation, on neurological function, on our emotions, and so on. The evidence is now showing that if you want to create a stronger, more youthful brain, manage your emotions, improve your ability to fight disease and prevent illness, meditation, a traditionally spiritual practice, may be the key. The fact that the NIH has now funded over 700 studies on the effects of meditation on the brain is staggering proof that science is becoming fully immersed in the study of ideas and concepts that have historically been pursued only within the realm of the spiritual. We also discussed a little about theories of consciousness and the scientific debate over when consciousness arises. If we are all made from the same stardust of the universe, if the atoms in my body are derived from the same place where the atoms in this podium come from, how is it that I am conscious and self-aware, but this podium, by most accounts, is not? How some scientists believe that consciousness only arises at a certain level of anatomical complexity, but other scientists believe that the basic building blocks themselves, those things that we started out as, must have some degree of sentience, some degree of awareness or ability to make choices. And then as those physical components engage to more and more complex arrangements, the quality of the consciousness increases. And finally, we reviewed Heisenberg's celebrated uncertainty principle, which demonstrates that the only way to know in which state an electron is in, wave or particle, is to observe it. So the observer defines the reality by the very act of observation. Think about that. That's an incredibly spiritual notion. In essence, that we create our reality and only when there is an observer. Joseph Campbell, a great comparative mythology scholar, does not believe that science and mythology or religion conflict. He says, science is breaking through now into the mystery dimensions. It's pushed itself into the sphere the myth is talking about. It's come to the edge, the interface between what can be known and what is never to be discovered, because it is a mystery that transcends all human research. So, as I explained last summer, my hypothesis in all of this, and what I invite you to explore with me again this morning, is that science and spirituality are both seeking answers to the same question. But they can also be reconciled, I think. I believe that not only are science and spirit born of the same reality and the same consciousness, but that ultimately they are part of the same truth. So how do we integrate? That's the question, right? What would it mean if the great thinkers from all our wisdom and spiritual traditions got together with the top scientists of the world, and together they birthed a theory, one that truly integrated science with spirit? What would that look like? How would it operate in our world? Well, I first want to be sure that we're all on the same page with respect to this idea of integration. Because what I'm speaking of is not really the idea of integrating the great religions of the world, like the perennial philosophy does under the concept of enlightenment. In 1944, in an attempt to offer a solution to humanity's ills, Aldous Huxley wrote that the highest common factor among world religions and spiritual traditions was enlightenment, knowing God experientially, and that at our soul level of being, we are one with the source. If the world could come to an agreement on the baseline commonality of the great religions, no matter the culture, civilization, or era, then humanity could unite under a single core truth, and communities could shed their need for religious domination and the violence resulting from that quest. If the religions and their religious fanatics would come together under such a convening philosophy, then indeed I would go so far as to say that the violence we experience in our world today might just vanish. However, that is not ultimately the integration I'm talking about today. I seek to go that next step, to integrate the core truth of enlightenment with the core truths of science. Unfortunately, the birth of the perennial philosophy came about around the same time as modern science began to take off. Instead of working on an integration of the two, modern science launched an attack on the perennial philosophy as scientific breakthroughs came rushing in the beginning of the middle of the 20th century. Modern science began to view the world in a purely materialistic way, that only those things in the world that were directly observable and measurable were real, undermining the very existence of our inner world. This scientific worldview painted humanity as alone in a hostile, unsympathetic universe without any purpose or meaning. Our worldview became increasingly dualistic. Last summer, I posed the idea that, of all things, science may ultimately, and ironically, be what leads us to a marriage of these two concepts. But now, I think I was wrong. At least, I don't believe science alone could bring us the knowledge we need to understand the spiritual world. I admit now that there are realms I don't believe science can observe, and therefore cannot measure and cannot explain. And it is these realms that require the knowledge of spiritual traditions in order to understand them. The knowledge of the inner self that often cannot be scientifically replicated in a lab. Yes, we did discuss last summer that functional MRI machines can now show us exactly what is happening in our brains when we are experiencing emotions. When we are experiencing love or joy or anger, we scientifically know what cocktail of chemicals are produced to create those experiences of love or fear or an experience of the divine in our brains and in our bodies. But I ask you, are those chemicals the totality of that experience? I don't believe they are. As science advances and is able to observe and demonstrate more and more of what is happening in our world, does that necessarily mean that that which science is observing and explaining objectively becomes reduced just to atoms and quarks and chemicals? Joseph Campbell lays this out beautifully. He says, anyone who has had an experience of mystery knows that there is a dimension of the universe that is not that which is available to his senses. Thus, for our ultimate theory, I think science can only get us so far. I trust that perhaps many of you have had a type of peak experience. An experience that cannot be explained, observed objectively, or measured, tallied. It is those peak experiences, those realms which require the knowledge of our internal spiritual world in order to understand them. I myself recently had such a peak experience a couple of weeks ago, in fact, at a spiritual retreat with my meditation teacher. He guided us through a meditation that included a very specific type of breathing exercise, one that I had never done before, something called the breath of fire. It was extremely physically challenging, something I never expected because we were breathing. And I was in the middle of this very forceful breathing technique, and the bridge across my eyebrows began to just burn like fire. My upper back, where my lungs sit, also began to burn. But I pushed through, not really understanding why we were doing this or what this was good for, but I kept on, more out of curiosity than anything else, when suddenly, at a point when I truly was in pain, an image of the universe coalesced in my mind. And it was like stars and galaxies unfolding in front of me. And right then, when I honestly thought I could just no longer breathe in this manner, I had a sudden moment of clarity where I knew that I was the breath. I was the source of that vast, expanding universe before me. But it wasn't this anthropomorphic God. It wasn't any type of human presence or understanding. It simply was, I am the breath. I think we as humans tend to personify such experiences and anthropomorphize these natural forces. But the reality is the ultimate energy or source can be impersonal, and it's okay. Joseph Campbell says, what is the meaning of a flower? There is no meaning. What is the meaning of the universe? What is the meaning of a flea? It's just there. That's it. And your own meaning is that you're there. We're so engaged in doing things to achieve outer value that we forget that the inner value, the rapture that is associated with being alive, is what it's all about. So, whatever our ultimate truth is, it must integrate both the observable science of the universe, our operating system, as well as the experiential spirit of the universe, our internal consciousness. And it needs to do so in a way, I think, that transcends them both. The ultimate truth must go beyond the operating system that bounds our experience to time and space and to categories of thought, because the ultimate truth that we are so desperately seeking is not so enclosed. We only enclose it so that our human minds can wrap around it. So, where do we go from here? How do we propose to link these two worlds, that seemingly unsympathetic, cold, observable universe, with the inner knowledge that we are part of that source and not separate from it? How do we bring these spaces together in a way that honors and elevates both? I want to share with you one scientific example of where I think we're starting to see this kind of integration, and it's fascinating to me. It's a place where the two are at the edge, and in my view, that is the study of the growing field of epigenetics. This is a place where science is beginning to understand that our human minds can physiologically alter our bodies and our experience. And I'll explain. So one very simple example would be in this area that I think many of us know in contemplative practice, meditation. Our meditation time can lower our blood pressure. It can reduce our heart rates. Even more impactfully, as we discussed last summer, there is research demonstrating that contemplative practice can have a direct effect, often in as little as 6 weeks, on the physiological makeup of our brains. In 6 weeks, they've shown that you can enlarge your prefrontal cortex. actual brain matter, and you can reduce the size of your amygdala where all of those fight or flight responses happen. And now we are learning through studies in epigenetics, and this is what's astounding to me, that meditation can also turn on gene receptors for disease prevention, and likewise can turn off receptors for disease expression. Dr. Bruce Lipton is a noted cellular biologist. He, along with other leading epigenetic scientists, are beginning to figure out how scientifically that works. They've made stunning new discoveries about the interactions between your mind and body and the processes by which your cells receive information. Dr. Lipton has shown that genes and DNA do not necessarily control our biology. That instead, DNA is controlled by signals from outside the cell, including the energetic messages emanating from our thoughts. I'm going to repeat that because it's really impactful. DNA and our genes do not necessarily control our biology. Instead, DNA is controlled by signals from outside the cell, including energetic messages emanating from thoughts. Think about that. It's powerful. The concept alone, in my view, beautifully integrates our interior mind with our external environment, at least in this case, our bodies. And that's just one example. It's why I think we are starting to get there, to this integration. But now we come to the big so what question. What exactly do these scientific principles do for us spiritually? And how do our spiritual answers play out certain scientific truths? What do these answers matter unless they somehow drive how we live and why we live, right? So what if I'm energy that's existed since the dawn of time and will continue to exist long after my human body has become worm food? So what about all the scientific principles from quantum theory to atoms with consciousness? So what about the spiritual principles? So what if enlightenment is the recognition of ourselves, our soul as the source? These concepts mean nothing unless applied to how we live our lives. In John Green's great coming-of-age novel, The Fault in Our Stars, if you have a teenager who reads, you know John Green, the father confesses to his teenage daughter, Hazel. He says, "I believe the universe wants to be noticed. I think the universe is improbably biased toward consciousness, that it rewards intelligence in part because the universe enjoys its elegance being observed." Later in the book, Hazel and her friend Isaac sit thinking about the death of their mutual friend Gus, and his confession before his death that he feared, above all, oblivion. Hazel says, "And I told him that the problem is not suffering itself or oblivion itself, but the depraved meaninglessness of these things, the absolutely inhuman nihilism of suffering. I thought of my dad telling me that the universe wants to be noticed, but what we want is to be noticed by the universe. To have the universe give a shit what happens to us, each of us as individuals." You know, I think both Hazel and her father are right. The universe wants to be noticed. Why else would it strive for and evolve to ever higher levels of consciousness, including those highest levels with the intelligence to create science, to observe or notice itself? But likewise, we humans crave being noticed by our world, which I think is why we anthropomorphize nature and our experience of it. We imbue the universe with a soul because with a soul, the universe has life and it can care. To somehow know that the universe cares, sees us, and notices our individual human lives. That's why we create our religions and why we find comfort in that perceived personal relationship with an almighty being. What if instead we took to heart that everything is really just energy in some form or another? And I mean really took that scientific concept to heart and lived it daily. What if we accepted that the stuff of the universe, the light, quarks, strings, black holes, the dark matter, what if we accepted that all of that stuff has a certain level of its own consciousness? Think about what that does to our place in the universe. First, I think it would prioritize our human existence right up there with the energy of a gravitational pull or of a spinning planet or dying star. Because energy is energy. No one form is better or worse than another. We then would no longer be subject to the whims of the universe, but rather an equally vital part of it. Secondly, a deep understanding that all of the stuff of the universe is energy gives rise to the idea that we can be the creators of our world. If thought, intention, and vision can all be reduced ultimately to energy, then that energy can transform into physical reality every single day. It means the universe lives through us, with or without a belief in God or in a particular religion. If so, then every single person, every being, every life is spiritual. In fact, at a very deep level, it is virtually impossible not to lead a spiritual life. You cannot opt out of it. Science is really like the operating system of our universe. And as such, it applies to everyone equally and even works along principles that do not require our participation at all. But here is the rub. And here is where the spirit piece is so important. Most lives are lived and led without awareness or intention. So people are creating their inner and outer worlds without realizing that they are the creators. So they live as though they are like that ball in a pinball machine, reacting and bouncing off the external world they live in. But those who choose to lead or strive to lead a consciously spiritual life, they create their world with intention and vision, with an awareness of how the energy of their thoughts can manifest in the physical world. And isn't that what ties this all together? Suddenly, then, the universe and its scientific rules of creation become personal. Your physical world mirrors your mind. It carries intention, intelligence in every atom. The duality that our human existence craves, that our ego craves, that me versus them, the inside versus the outside, nature versus nurture, religion versus science, it all ceases to exist. We live in unity. We no longer live according to an assumption that we are separate from our outside world or that we live among a chaotic, unsympathetic universe. These understandings for me did not come until years after the passing of Rocky and Rosie. After my divorce and subsequent searching for answers, it was strangely science that brought me closer to spirit. And when I was in my darkest hours, when I was collapsed in the middle of the living room floor, sobbing over the life of that I wasn't going to lead, sobbing over the loss of that vision for my life, I strangely found that the only thought that could instantly take that pain away was thinking about the greatness of the universe and how temporary my human existence really was. I know that seems odd that would make me feel better. But for some reason, it really did. And I think it's because I knew deep down that my human existence was just a temporary housing of eternal energy. And now, years after that painful time, I not only continue to be comforted by thinking about the universe in this way, but I'm also fully aware of how that painful time was also my creation. I know I create my life and I shape my existence all according to the choices I make and the thoughts I think every day. And when I recognize this, and it's hard every day, and when I strive to live intentionally and with full awareness, painful feelings just, they melt away. And I shift into a sense of oneness with something much greater than my current experience. A oneness with a vast and soulful universe. Thank you.
Please rise. Sing with me.
Whoops, missed my page here. My closing words. So my closing words speak not only to our efforts here today to understand the great possibilities that exist when we integrate science and spirit into a united truth, but they speak to the next adventure, perhaps to how we can use this united vision to bring about political enlightenment. And to that, I share with you a closing paragraph from Ken Wilber's The Next Horizon. And perhaps political freedom joined with spiritual freedom, time joined with the timeless, space joined with infinity, we will come finally to rest, finally to peace, finally to a home that structures care into the cosmos and compassion into the world, that touches each and every soul with grace and goodness and goodwill, and lights each being with a glory that never fades or falters. And we are called, you and I, by the voice of the good, and the voice of the true, and the voice of the beautiful, called exactly in those terms to witness the liberation of all sentient beings without exception. On the distant, silent, lost horizon, gentle as fog, quiet as tears, the voice continues to call.
I know, getting here was the hardest part. Getting here was the hardest part. Slid halfway through an intersection. But luckily no one was coming. The car behind me was not so lucky. No, there was I think they had done the same thing I did. Turning out of our neighborhood, there's a turn that's pretty hard to see around.